You are listening to Parliament Matters, a Hansard Society production supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Learn more at hansardsociety.org.uk/pm.
Welcome to Parliament Matters, the podcast about the institution at the heart of our democracy, Parliament itself. I'm Ruth Fox.
And I'm Mark Darcy. Coming up.
When everyone is talking about you, but you don't get to speak. Strange case of Diane Abbott at Prime Minister's Question Time.
Plus, Henry VIII powers, how the sinister legacy of that murderous monarch may now be a threat to parliamentary democracy.
And the loneliness of the one-person party, from Conservative Deputy Chairman to Reform's lone MP. What might the future hold for Lee Anderson?
But first, Ruth, I suppose we've really got to start on events at this week's Prime Minister's Question Time, which was dominated by the issue of the rather unpleasant remarks made about Diane Abbott, the first black woman MP, who's now currently suspended from the Labour whip, incidentally, by a significant Tory donor. Sir Keir Starmer questioned the Prime Minister about it. Stephen Flynn of the SNP questioned the Prime Minister about it. Other Labour MPs questioned the Prime Minister about it. Diane Abbott was at the back of the chamber, standing up and down, trying to catch Mr. Speaker's eye to the point where you feared for her knees. But she didn't get a word in edgeways, and she was the subject of the discussion. So what was going on?
Yeah, it just looked terrible and absolutely appalling image of the operation of the Commons for the watching public, and particularly for women, I have to say. So the whole week basically has been dominated by the Conservative Party and 10 Downing Street being unable to get on top of this story and give a straight response. So we've got this Conservative Party donor, Frank Hester, who has donated millions and millions of pounds to the Conservative Party. But he's reported to have said a few years ago, talking about Diane Abbott, that you just want to hate all black women because she's there. And I don't hate all black women at all, but I think she should be shot. Now, this is the subject of the discussion at PMQs, where, as you say, Keir Starmer and Stephen Flynn are trying to pin down Rishi Sunak in terms of an apology, commitment to give the money back, and so on.
10 million quid here.
And Rishi Sunak, for 24, 36 hours beforehand, had been sending out ministers onto the airwaves, and they'd not been giving a sort of a straight response. Was this racist language? Was this misogynistic? Were they prepared to say that they'd give the money back? The line, it clearly was never going to hold. And ministers were going out clearly with a line they weren't comfortable with. At some point late in the day before PMQ's, Kemi Badenoch has clearly had enough and breaks ranks, and she comes out and says, yes, it was racist, yes, it was misogynistic. But,
and she's Minister for Women and Equality, so...
Yeah, but, he's apologised, and we should accept that apology, the contrition, and move on. Now, Diane Abbott, who's at the centre of this, she's apparently reported these remarks to the Parliamentary Liaison and Investigations Team, which is the police unit set up in the aftermath of the Joe Cox murder in 2016. So she's the centrepiece then at PMQs. First thing that strikes me is that Rishi Sunak did not issue an apology to Diane Abbott. I mean, at no point in the remarks during PMQs does he really apologise to her.
He didn't address her, and she was there directly in front of him, pretty much.
No apology on behalf of the Conservative Party. But then it gets even worse because, as you say, she's bobbing up and down numerous times. I mean, I think Sky News calculated 46 occasions she bobs. And this is the process by which MPs stand up in the chamber to try and catch the Speaker's eye in order to ask a supplementary question at PMQs. And on each occasion, she's ignored by the Speaker. So it looks absolutely terrible.
Now, the technical explanation for this is that the Speaker, when he's chairing the Prime Minister's Question Time session, has to make sure that he has a straight balance between speakers from the opposition benches and speakers from the government benches. They've got to be equal numbers. And the difficulty with that every week is that he also has to include MPs who've been randomly selected, without reference to their party, to ask a question. And as it turned out this time, when there was the ballot for asking questions, 15 names come out, 11 of them this time were already opposition party speakers. So it was quite difficult for the Speaker to crowbar in an additional opposition party questioner, in theory. But the Speaker has very wide discretion, not least over how long he lets Prime Minister's questions run for. So he could have gone through the whole list and then let it run a little bit longer, so that he could also allow a question from Diane Abbott. So it was certainly within the realms of possibility for him to bring in an additional person if he wanted to, but I suppose maybe he's had his fingers rather badly burned by stretching the rules in the past.
Yeah, but the problem he's now got is by not applying his discretion, it looks from the outside as, here is this woman who's being racially abused, who's had to sit quietly, well, bobbing up and down, but essentially has been rendered voiceless while the big boys at the Despatch Box are duking it out. And she has to sit quietly at the back and, her voice in all this debate is silenced.
Not a good look. I suppose the alternative was that he could have allowed her to raise a point of order, perhaps even tipped her off that a good idea would be to raise a point of order at the end of Prime Minister's questions and use that as a mechanism for her having her say. But none of that happened, and Diane Abbott sat there throughout the whole session, the whole half hour. She was the centre of discussion. She didn't get a chance to say her piece.
An interesting question, we won't get an answer to this, but an interesting question would be, what did the Speaker, the Deputy Speakers, their officials talk about and discuss in relation to this? So every day before parliamentary business starts, there's a meeting, it's called a Speakers' Conference, where the Speaker, the Deputy Speakers, the senior clerks meet, and they sort of discuss what are the issues and challenges in terms of parliamentary business that they anticipate, how they're going to handle them, selection of amendments, are they going to accept an application for an urgent question, and so on. You would have thought that the question about Diane Abbott, because it's dominated politics, the political airwaves for the previous 24, 36 hours, you would think that would have been discussed and think about how you would manage that. And therefore, to go into PMQs, of course, the Speaker will be thinking, I've really got to take many more questions from the government benches in order to balance this lopsided outcome from the ballot for PMQ questions. But I've actually got to deal with this issue as well. Equally, you could say, well, Diane Abbott could have stood up and made a point of order at the end of PMQs, but I think, she's been in the House long enough to know what the procedures are, but I suspect she probably thought, sod it, I don't think I'll bother.
It's not necessarily very satisfactory either, because often when people are raising points of order at the end of Prime Minister's questions, everyone's sort of getting up and going, the chamber's emptying, there's a lot of hubbub, and often the Deputy Speaker is taking the chair ahead of the Speaker, so you're not getting the same audience. It's no longer prime time. No. The TV will have cut away.
And she shouldn't have to, is the bottom line. It should have been dealt with in a way that enabled her to make her point, to have her say.
I'm afraid it's something else that will be held in evidence against Mr. Speaker Hoyle, that he didn't quite get this one right, and he's not had a happy couple of weeks. So we'll have to see what Diane Abbott's next move is. It may be that she applies for a debate, or asks to make a personal statement, or something. But I don't think we've heard the last of this, or of her, quite yet.
No. So, as you say, the Speaker's position probably, blotted his copybook again in the eyes of quite a considerable number of backbenchers, and people are not happy. But I don't think it was good for Rishi Sunak either, because I think it conveyed a degree of political naivety on his part in terms of the management of the issue. And also, some MPs have been saying a certain lack of grace in how he handled it in the chamber.
One of those revealing little moments afterwards, both Keir Starmer and Stephen Flynn, the SNP leader, went up to have a word with Diane Abbott. I imagine Diane Abbott took the opportunity to put in a plea to have the Labour whip restored to her.
Apparently she did, yeah.
So, again, watch that space to see what happens there. So she may have a sort of full-on Soviet-style rehabilitation process now.
Well, I think the fact that, for context, Diane Abbott gets more abuse than any other MP in the House of Commons, and has done for years. And I do think it raises that question of the duty of care that parties have to their MPs in these circumstances. As you say, she lost the whip, nearly a year ago now, for her comments, which were inappropriate. She apologised for them. But you do have to question, why has it taken nearly a year to decide whether or not she should regain the whip or not?
And, of course, regaining the whip or not as an election looms is fairly critical to whether she can remain as a Member of Parliament.
Yeah. And, it raises all of those sorts of questions about, does the party have a responsibility to its MPs, particularly when it's in the kind of situation that Diane Abbott is in, where if they're excluded from, the sort of party and decision-making processes and all the support structures that come with the party, she's particularly exposed because of the nature of the abuse that she particularly gets.
Absolutely. Well, as we're recording, Ruth, MPs are debating the estimates. mystical process by which Parliament authorises the spending of billions upon billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, you'd imagine a crowded chamber, fiery speeches, ministers under fire, see the whites of their eyes, but not so much.
No. So we should explain that what they're debating is what's called supplementary estimates, which are essentially the sort of the revised final departmental spending plans as we approach the end of the financial year. So what changes in the departmental budgets do they need, and what more money do they need to cover things? And interestingly, the House of Commons Library, which is an excellent resource if you're not already looking at their briefing papers and research papers, listeners. It's a fabulous resource. You should sign up to their newsletters and get those in your inbox. So they've produced a briefing on the estimates, and they've basically said that they're asking for more money than at any point in time other than during the first year of COVID, since 2015, 2016. You think about what we've had in that period of political and economic dislocation. We've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the cost of energy cost crisis, we've had Brexit, and yet the request is second only to the first year of COVID.
So what's the money spent on?
According to the library, the three biggest drivers of this are, one, the pay settlements with the public sector, and particularly the NHS pay settlement.
So
the doctors' pay. And then secondly, the impact of inflation on the student loan book, which means it's had to have essentially been revalued, which is costing the Department for Education a huge sum of money. And then the third is asylum, which is one of the subjects of the two estimates day debates today that the MPs are considering.
So is this the costs of the Rwanda scheme, the costs of accommodating migrants in this country, all of the above?
It's not really the Rwanda scheme, because we haven't got to that. I mean, there's bits of that. But interestingly, the Home Office didn't put in for as much money at the start of the year in what's called the main estimates, when they put together their budgets and spending plans, as they would normally do. So there's an awful lot more money coming in now later in the year that they're requesting parliamentary authorisation for. Home Office Select Committee is not happy with that because, of course, it makes it much more difficult for them to scrutinise so late in the financial cycle what the government's spending the money on. But essentially, they've asked for an extra £5.9 billion. £4 billion of that relates to the cost for asylum, £1.2 billion to implement the Illegal Migration Act. So the act prior to the Rwanda bill, and they haven't fully implemented that yet, and £500 million for the Afghan resettlement scheme. Now, precisely because the Home Office did not ask for as much money upfront earlier in the year, in the start of the financial year, as they could have done and normally would, they actually had to get an emergency cash advance of £2.6 billion to cover them.
Well, we've all been there.
Yeah, sort of like your emergency credit card. So, people are not happy with the amount of money and the way in which it's been profiled in the financial cycle, and it is difficult to scrutinise. But MPs are looking at that in a short debate today.
And I'd imagine somewhere down on the list as well, the Minister of Defence presumably is wanting a bit of money as well for the costs of supplying all those arms to Ukraine.
Yeah, so they've asked for, I think it's another £1 billion to sort of replenish stocks, as it's described. There's other sort of nuggets. I mean, apparently the Grenfell Tower inquiry has returned, you don't often hear this, returned £9.9 million of unspent funding. But the COVID inquiry wants more money, so it all balances out.
Well, another interesting parliamentary development, or perhaps development for Parliament in the future, that came up this week was Sir Keir Starmer announcing that Labour would find a way to allow a debate to take place, presumably in the next Parliament now, on assisted dying. And this is something that's been rumbling around on the fringes of parliamentary activity really for quite a while. One of my annual tasks watching private members' bills in my BBC days was to see if someone would finally attempt to do an assisted dying bill again after the implosion of the rather disastrous 2017 attempt at legalisation by the Labour MP Rob Maris. There are all sorts of people who are very strongly for it. There are all sorts of people who are very strongly against it. And the trouble with attempting to do it by a private members' bill is that private members' bills are quite deliberately procedurally extremely vulnerable. A determined group of parliamentary guerrilla can stop them in their tracks, and tactics like putting down endless amendments, all of which have to be debated at report stage, and then you run out of time and kaboom, the bill is gone. So the idea of a government saying it will find time for the issue to be debated suggests that they're looking at another route to at least examine this issue in great detail.
The other option, of course, is that the government might decide in the next Parliament, if it is a Labour government, that they want to reframe the parliamentary timetable because of the size and scale and their legislative programme and the rapidity with which they want to get on with it. And one of the options is possibly reform of private members' bills. There's been, we are advocates of some changes. The Procedure Committee of the House of Commons has made recommendations for changes. So that could be an option. If you change the procedures, you make it not easier, but you resolve or address some of those procedural obstacles which would exist now in terms of the normal arrangements for private members' bills. And that might then be a way in which you can utilise that route for things like, as you say, the assisted dying bill. But of course, the critical question is, would it be on a free vote? One assumes so, as a sort of moral question, as opposed to something on which parties necessarily have very clear dividing lines.
I think it would be a very, very dangerous issue to attempt to impose a party whip on. You'd have a lot of people with very strong convictions on both sides of the debate who simply wouldn't be told this is how you're going to vote on this issue. And so you're setting yourself up for a quite unnecessary fight with the whips over this. This is a classic free vote issue. What I'm imagining here, I'm looking back to precedents from 20 years ago now when the Labour government put up a bill to ban hunting with hounds and indeed other forms of hunting. This is after several unsuccessful attempts to do this via a private members' bill. And what they did was they put up a quite sort of vanilla bill that would still allow some licensed hunting in the expectation that MPs might well then attempt to amend it. And I think it was Tony Banks, the late Labour MP, led an attempt to go for an outright ban, which got through, and the hunting ban was thereby introduced. But they started with quite a sort of vanilla, if I can call it that, option, and let the House on a free vote toughen it up, and the House did so, and eventually it was tanked through the House of Lords. It took a while. There was quite a scrap over it. There were enormous Countryside Alliance demonstrations on several occasions. So it was quite a thing. And you might see something similar happen this time. Maybe the government will come up with its own wording and its own draft bill and see how MPs want to amend it. But I imagine they would want to keep a very close eye on the precise wording, because the endless legal troubles of having a badly worded bill on an issue like this. Imagine the courts would be tied in knots for years if MPs got it wrong. So one way or another, the government's dibs would be on the eventual product, but they'd try and go with the opinion of the House.
Yeah, I mean, you've got frameworks in terms of existing drafts that have been put through the House of Lords, for example, in terms of PMBs. You take that. I mean, it's an obvious candidate possibly for pre-legislative scrutiny to let committees, each House or a joint committee, have a go at it, make some suggestions, take evidence. And if the government did want to, make the time, it's the kind of thing which, it's not going to be a huge bill. It's not going to be, one imagines, a very lengthy bill.
But you could still give it a generous watch of time just to avoid it being criticised for being rushed through.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it's the kind of thing that you might fit in as your sort of second tranche of bills in a session after your big ones have started through the pipeline. Once they've gone to the House of Lords, you've then got time in the Commons to fill. So you kind of want these filler bills, which are smaller, and which you can devote a bit of time to.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you were talking about private members' bills earlier. Just an incoming Labour government that wanted to do a lot of things very quickly has a convenient precedent here. In 1945, when Clement Attlee's Labour government came in, the then leader of the House, Herbert Morrison, Lord President of the Council and the kind of ringmaster of the government's legislative programme, actually suspended private members' bills for, I think, at least 1 year, possibly for longer than that, in order to make more time for all the other things the government wanted to do. So an interesting precedent to contemplate.
Yeah, I don't think that's one we really at the Hansard Society would endorse. Well, Mark, should we leave it there for a short break? And coming up, we've got an interview with Professor David Howarth, former MP, who's got a lecture with the Statute Law Society this evening to talk about Henry VIII powers. So more after the break.
If you're enjoying the pod and think like Mark and I do that Parliament matters, why not join the Hansard Society? This year we celebrate our 80th anniversary, and throughout the year we'll have a number of special events to mark this important milestone. For as little as a cup of coffee each month, you can join us and follow in the footsteps of our first members, Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee. And if you're enjoying the issues that we're talking about on the pod, you'll also be getting our special members-only Despatch Box newsletter each week, where we bring together the best news and stories about parliaments here in the UK and around the world. You can join by going to hansardsociety.org.uk/membership.
Now, when most people think of Henry VIII, they think of the 6 wives and their various unhappy fates. When historians think of Henry VIII, they probably think of the dissolution of the monasteries and the reformation of the English Church. When a constitutionalist thinks of Henry VIII, they think of something rather more specific, the 1539 Proclamations Act, which gave that murderous monarch the power to make law by proclamation, or at least so he thought. It was heroically resisted by the Parliament of the day, and the consequences of resisting Henry VIII's will were there for all to see. But there's a legacy to the idea of so-called Henry VIII powers that resonates through to our Constitution today, and a warning note about that legacy has been sounded by David Howarth, former Liberal Democrat MP, now Professor of Law at Cambridge University. David, you're extremely worried that Henry VIII's powers are ultimately corroding parliamentary democracy. Explain.
Well, we should probably start with what a Henry VIII power is. It's a power created by an Act of Parliament, and the Act of Parliament says that a minister can make further changes, not just in terms of secondary legislation filling in details, but in changing primary legislation, that is, changing other Acts of Parliament. Sometimes this is previous Acts of Parliament, sometimes it's the very Act of Parliament that's being passed. Sometimes it includes future Acts of Parliament. And that kind of power means that ministers can bypass Parliament. They needn't go through having the readings of bills, they needn't go through the committee stages and the detailed consideration of bills in the two houses.
So they could just in effect say, we've decided to rewrite the law in the following way, this is it, and that's that. Nothing Parliament can do about it.
That's right. And the problem with that is that it just ignores Parliament. So usually they're set up so that there could be one vote in each house. Although in past times that could be set up so that you couldn't have a vote in the House of Commons because the government controls the agenda and you wouldn't have the time to do it. You were reliant on a vote in the House of Lords, and the House of Lords wouldn't do it because they were afraid that they weren't democratically legitimate, and if they kept doing that sort of thing, the Commons would get rid of them. So in effect, this is ministers changing the law, and not just changing minor law, but changing fundamental law if that's what the power allows.
And how long has this been going on? Because you point in the lecture that you're giving about this subject to the Regulatory Reform Bill.
The Legislative and Regulatory Reform Bill, that's in 2006. I mean, to be fair to Henry VIII, as you explained, he didn't get away with getting this sort of power, and perhaps he didn't want it in the first place, and all sorts of historical debates about what exactly was going on in the Proclamations Act. And I used to sit at lunch in my college in Cambridge next to Geoffrey Elton, the great Tudor historian, who explained that this was all nonsense and there was no such thing as a Henry VIII clause in Henry VIII's time. So the first one that you can track down is in the 1880s, the Local Government Act in 1888. But there were more of them in subsequent decades, including ones passed by the great Liberal government in 1906. And from about the early 20s, academics, reformers, judges, parliamentary committees have constantly complained about them. There was another bout of them under the Thatcher government, so there was a committee of inquiry chaired by Geoffrey Rippon, if you remember him, reporting in the late 80s, and then further complaints and reports. Lord Judge, the Lord Chief Justice, made a speech about it, various academics, various lawyers, and committees to the House of Lords saying this is a bad thing and should be stopped.
But the question that really has to be asked about this is, why does Parliament wear it? Why do parliamentarians put up with being bypassed in this way? You give ministers the power to do really quite fundamental changes to the law, and they have no role.
That's right, and that's what my lecture's about. The question is, why does the political system, including government backbenchers, put up with this kind of thing? The normal argument for Henry VIII clauses is it's a sensible convenience to allow ministers to tidy up the statute book if there are anomalies or if not all the changes that were logically required by a piece of legislation have been spotted by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, or if there are conflicts in the future that you need to tidy up. So that's the standard argument. But the problem is that doesn't explain the extent of powers that are being granted now. Both the powers that were granted under New Labour when I was an MP in the bill you referred to in 2006, but also more recently, vast powers being granted under the Brexit legislation, under the Strikes Act, under the new Regulation of Subsidy Act, vast powers which can apply not just to law in the past, but also law in the future. And if you look at those acts and the kind of powers that are being granted, they're not just non-controversial matters. I remember sitting in a committee room in the Commons in 2006 listening to Jim Murphy, a very affable minister, saying that he would never use...
This is, of course, Labour Minister.
Labour Minister, yes. Saying he would never use these powers for anything controversial. And, of course, eventually on that bill, the government gave way in lots of different ways. But they never allowed anyone else to define what was controversial. Right? They always kept that power to decide what was controversial themselves.
So the sky's the limit.
Yeah. And the problem is that if you've got that sort of power, what you've got the power to do is to change policy in quite fundamental ways without parliamentary discussion. And especially the acts that have been passed in the past 5 years, what they allow is the government to kind of sweep away previous legislation by previous parliaments that stand in the way of the policy that they're adopting, and even to allow them to change their own policy drastically without further parliamentary discussion. And that's very interesting. It kind of says to the opposition, you've had your say, you've lost, you have no role anymore in policy making. There's no more argument to be heard from you, just go away. And it even says that to government backbenchers. The government backbenchers have had their go, and this is as far as they get, and they get no further say. So it's protecting the government's ability to make policy without parliamentary scrutiny.
Are you of the view that we should abolish them altogether in the way that, for example, Lord Judge, who you mentioned, recently died, sadly, but former convener of the crossbench peers, his great speech on this talked about consigning Henry VIII powers to the dustbin of history. Now, the counter-argument, and one we at the Hansard Society have always said, is, well, let's look at the function, not just the form, that actually Henry VIII powers, for example, to change a name in a bill if you were changing, I don't know, a government department or a pension benefit or something, you needed to rename things and you needed to amend primary legislation for that. That genuine tidying up is fine. But, as you say, the much greater scope to amend policy is where this becomes worrying. And is it really the powers, or is it actually then the fact that the scrutiny procedures downstream are so poor?
Well, it's both. The House of Lords, as you say, is just always worried that it's an illegitimate institution, and so won't exercise even the powers it's formally got. The House of Commons is subject to majority rule, although it's not always subject to majority rule. So when you have a minority government, there's more of a scope for the Commons to do things. But nevertheless, its procedures basically don't have much effect on these sorts of order. There are very complicated procedures for some sorts of order, especially the ones under the Leg and Reg Act as it became, which allows other committees to have a say. But normally all you get is a 90-minute debate in a committee room which members use to attack the government on some issue of the day. There's a motion passed that the committee has considered it. That goes to the House without further discussion. And if there is a vote, it's a vote on pink paper on a Wednesday lunchtime without any proper debate.
There's a deferred division.
Yeah. The test is whether this power goes beyond the mere technical. One test I'm interested in is if you have a statute that would be taken by the courts impliedly to repeal some previous statute, then, of course, that's the kind of circumstance where it'd be okay to have a power to make the implied repeal explicit. But that doesn't justify any Henry VIII power for future law. There's a kind of strange formula that now been developed which builds in a Henry VIII clause to change past laws and any other law passed in this session.
So it's sort of self-rewriting
yes,
law.
That's right. So, sorry, we've changed our mind, so we're going to have a different policy.
And sometimes it's also to amend the act that contains the power.
That's right, and to amend itself, which is always the problem with the initial draft of the 2006 Act. That's too much, right? That allows policy change. And
you had some very alarming examples in your speech about the kind of things that they might do.
There were some alarming examples under the original draft of the 2006 Act, which allowed the power to be used on the Act itself to remove all the restrictions, and then for the government to give itself powers to rule by decree. That would only be subject to a single vote in the House of Lords before it became law. And that's why the bill was called by my colleagues in the Cambridge Law Faculty the Abolition of Parliament Bill, because it reduced the whole of parliamentary democracy to one vote in an undemocratic House. To be fair to the government at the time, they kind of gave way on that, and the Act as passed includes a provision that the powers can't be used on the Human Rights Act and can't be used on the Act itself. And so they did build in safeguards eventually. But as I'm going to say in the lecture, there were certain aspects of the powers they were given they would just not give away. They wouldn't give away the right to decide themselves this basic question about whether the power is being used technically or being used substantively. That question they kept to themselves.
So whether or not it's tidying up or whether it's something so big that it ought to justify a full-dress parliamentary debate, maybe even an all-singing, all-dancing bill going through Parliament.
That's right. And so coming back to your initial question, the point is not just what the test should be, but who decides. Who decides whether this is technical or not? So what are the choices? You can give it to the government, which is what the government wants. You can give it to the courts that nobody wants. You can give it to the Commons, but that's subject to majority rule. And you give it to the Lords, but they won't use it. So this is why it's a terrible problem. One possibility is to give it to a joint committee of the Commons and the Lords, like in the same way as the Human Rights Committee, to say that they get to decide. And we've had examples of this kind of sorting committee being proposed, for example, during the Brexit legislation.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's happened as a result, I mean, really since the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Act, is that we have had these safeguards, these forms of strengthened scrutiny procedure. And I actually think that the House of Lords has sort of focused on that, trying to get those amendments into bills to constrain the powers that ministers are seeking, rather than saying, actually, is this power appropriate? Should we strike it out? Because they don't want to have that confrontation with government. That's part of the problem. But ironically, actually, the provisions that did eventually end up in the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Act, known as the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Order Process, the super-affirmative is what it's sort of procedurally known as. That actually has kind of a bit rebounded on the government now, because actually it's quite a tough scrutiny process to go through, and it takes quite a long time. So they actually have not brought, over the years, anywhere near as many of these legislative and regulatory reform orders as they expected. And in fact, government advice is that it's better to use primary legislation often because it's quicker.
Yeah, that's fair. Normally you can't amend one of these orders. Any kind of statutory instrument you can't amend. That's one of the big problems of it. And so there's a thing called super-affirmative procedure where you don't actually have amendments, but Parliament can kind of suggest amendments. It can say, well, we would have passed this if you'd said this. And then it goes back to the Minister, and the Minister can then decide whether to incorporate the amendment or not, and then to bring it back. What we have in 2006 Act is something else, which is something called the committee veto. And the committee veto allows other committees, select committees, by majority to block.
Has that ever been used?
Not as far as I know. Ruth might know different.
Well, the committee recommended that they not proceed with, I think it was the horse race betting levy order.
That's right. I've forgotten that one.
And the government, I think, dropped that in the end. Yeah. But no, I mean, it's not become a sort of standoff case.
No.
But going back to your point about amendment, I mean, you say part of the problem is it can't amend. I mean, we've been looking at this through our delegated legislation review, and it's incredibly difficult to conceive of a scenario in which you could introduce amendment of statutory instruments laid under powers in acts granted to ministers, because A, it undermines the principle of delegation in the first place. Why are we doing this? But secondly, you'd have to have a mechanism for reconciling the views of both houses, which means parliamentary time. It means a form of parliamentary ping-pong. So we've argued that actually that's not practical, but what you could have is a mechanism to put forward a proposal to amend the motion to approve the instrument, indicating what changes they'd like to see to bring the legal instrument within the bounds of acceptability for Commons and or Lords.
Yeah, that is basically the super-affirmative. That's the basic structure of super-affirmative. And it's also got something in common with the rather peculiar procedures for bills going through under the Parliament Act. But the question that lies behind this is, why are we delegating this to ministers in the first place? What kind of powers will we delegate?
You've got a very scary section in the speech about the underlying mentality of this, what you call the Whitehall view of parliamentary democracy, which is essentially that once you've had an election result, Parliament is there to rubber stamp the proceedings of the majority.
Yeah. So the Whitehall view of the Constitution, which becomes very clear to anyone who turns up in Westminster, is that Parliament's job after an election is simply as a kind of counting device to work out who's won the election. Then after that, their only job is to supply the government with the finance and the laws that it needs to implement their manifesto on which the government was elected. And that Parliament's job is not to do anything to block, ask awkward questions. And that Parliament actually is simply, when it's debating, it isn't really debating law. It's simply letting off steam. Its business is not to make policy. The government makes policy on the basis of what is put to the electorate. So the Whitehall view is a view of democracy. It's not an anti-democratic view. It's a very particular view of the way democracy works, not as a parliamentary democracy, but as a quasi-presidential system with Parliament just making noises.
As a sort of rubber stamp chamber.
And a letting off steam chamber.
Better than bottling it up, I suppose. But What's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is the theory of the Constitution that all lawyers seem to believe in, including the Supreme Court in the Miller 2 case, which is that we have
Miller 2 being the
prorogation case. Being the idea that we're a parliamentary democracy, and that means that Parliament gets to decide things. Parliament is the centre of the Constitution, not ministers. Elections elect members of Parliament. They have programmes which they're committed to the electorates, but the world always changes. It's not possible just to have this simple idea of the mandate. There always needs to be further discussion. Things turn out to be more difficult than you expected. And so policy needs to be decided by the interaction between the government and Parliament, in particular the Commons. In reality, that's what actually happens. The most important relationship in any parliament is that between the government and its own backbenches. Now, quite a bit of this happens not in public, though quite a bit does happen in public. You hear backbenchers complaining about things, and then ministers go and try and assuage their fears, either in debates or talking to them afterwards. There is that parliamentary aspect to the way we are governed. And the Westminster view of the Constitution, in contrast to the Whitehall view, is to emphasise that and to say that's what we are. We are a parliamentary democracy in the sense that the most important institution in the Constitution is the House of Commons.
Let me act as devil's advocate a bit here, because I've been a researcher of this stuff and an advocate for change for well over a decade now, banging my head against a brick wall like many who are advocating change in this area. The argument in Whitehall is if MPs were interested in this stuff and wanted to stop it, they could. In the House of Lords, the argument is, the drafters, for example, get blamed quite a lot by the House of Lords that the civil service is part of the problem, that they are allowing standards of legislative practice to slip. The argument from the drafters would be, well, you keep allowing it to happen because you keep accepting the powers in the first place. If you didn't accept the powers, if you rejected them, then we would be able to say to ministers, look, this will not get past the House of Lords. But at the moment, the evidence is that it will get past the House of Lords. So if the minister wants it, they can have it if they're prepared to stand up to the House of Lords a little bit. In the Commons, it's that the argument in Whitehall is, and indeed elsewhere, is that they're abdicating their role as legislators, that they are just not carrying out the kinds of parliamentary scrutiny that would have been conducted in your day, 10, 15 years ago. It is just on a slow route getting worse.
It is getting worse, and you just need to think about what the process is that's making it worse. The process is one that happens within the parties and the party leaderships. Party leaderships love it when MPs take no interest in legislation. When Labour had big majorities, there was this kind of weird system that they'd be sent back to their constituencies.
Constituency weeks.
That's right, in a kind of rota,
Yeah.
so that they wouldn't bother the government and they could go and campaign in their seats.
We might have it in the next Parliament.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if we get another, get 500 Labour MPs, I mean, what are they all going to be doing? So the party leaderships are committed to a view of the Constitution, which is the Whitehall view. In fact, I originally called the Whitehall view the Hillary Armstrong view of the Constitution. Hillary Armstrong, the Labour chief whip, who was one of the main advocates for it, if you bumped into her and asked her how things worked, she would say that all these people trying to vote against things, that's anti-democratic. So the parties are the people driving this. You then get a kind of selection, kind of indirect selection process, where people who want to be MPs don't necessarily think that being an MP has got anything to do with legislation. They would prefer to be campaigners or local champions. I mean, my own party was very much to blame for the idea of an MP being a local champion as opposed to a national politician interested in legislation. And that had even worse effects on local government, where these MPs got to hang around their seats, getting in the way of the local council. It's not just Labour to blame, it's also Lib Dems. And recently, you can see why Conservative leadership wouldn't want MPs to be interested in legislation. When they were in 2017 to 19, that was the kind of worst nightmare in the Conservative Party leadership's history, right? So the parties are pushing this, and ministers are part of it. And actually, the civil service also is to blame. Now, you've given a very pro-civil service view of this, but civil servants...
Just to say I was devil's advocate, I'm not saying I
know, but
agree with it.
civil servants have been known basically to push this view on their ministers, right?
It's convenient for
It's just
them.
very convenient for civil servants as well. So yes, the culture of British politics is not very favourable to parliamentary democracy. I mean,
Can it be turned around? I mean, is this something that's just an irreversible tide?
Well, I don't think it's irreversible, but there are big elements that go into making it go the way it is. So one of those is just these official ideologies of the party leaderships. In the New Labour days was the additional thing of corporatism, of the idea that politics was about the management of the economic interests. And you'd see in the 2006 Act a specific reference in the consultation section of the Act to consulting the organisations which were representative of interests, a very corporatist view, where consulting those interests was more important than consulting members of Parliament. Right? That's one of the reasons why they weren't bothering with Parliament. You've also got, in the intellectual culture, if you look in academia, what are students now being taught that will affect them in 20, 30, 40 years' time when they're the people doing this. In politics courses especially, and political philosophy courses, there are very anti-parliamentary philosophers who are now very prominent. So it looks like a big task, but it's possible to fight back. It's possible to say that we do need a parliamentary democracy. Parliamentary democracy would be a good idea for various reasons, different reasons that might attract different people. For example, if you're a citizen, you don't have time to follow everything that's going on in Parliament. There was this naive view, wasn't there, that the internet was going to mean everybody would be following every single legislative instrument that was coming out of government or Parliament, and we'd all be kind of citizens all the time. Well, the problem with that is there isn't enough time in people's lives. If people really did do that, they wouldn't be going out to work. I mean, it would just be impossible. And so you need some kind of process, some parliamentary institution which will draw people's attention to times when things are going badly wrong and when they should pay attention. There needs to be some kind of tripwire which would engage the wider population more strongly in particular instances where it's worth their paying their attention to it. So Parliament needs to be able to act as that kind of tripwire, because nobody else around will do it. And you can only do that if MPs are paying attention to legislation. If they're just wandering around moaning about potholes as if they were the county councillor, then they're not doing that tripwire job. So I think you can put forward practical arguments and ideological arguments which would reinforce the view that what we're missing is parliamentary democracy.
And part of the framework of what we've been putting together with our review of delegated legislation, our proposals, is that how can we construct almost an incentive framework that doesn't just incentivise MPs to take more interest and engage with this legislation more, but also persuades government that whilst they may not like it, there's actually some benefits for them through the process. Because I know Mark, as we discovered in the last episode, is a bit of a cynic about this idea of any reform proposals that would involve the government giving up power for obvious reasons.
Yes.
But we therefore have to think quite creatively about how do we pitch the arguments for change to make this process more effective. One of them, for example, you talked about when you have these instruments being debated in these committees in the House of Commons. I mean, it's almost a complete waste of MPs' time, but it's also a big waste of time, ministerial time. Ministers have to set aside 90 minutes in their diary, their civil servants have to do it, they have to prepare a speech, there's lots of follow-up afterwards, and it's a ritual, and it barely lasts 20-odd minutes on average. Nobody's satisfied with the process. Yeah. The complexity that's come about through all these extra scrutiny procedures that have had to be built in to exercise some degree of control over the powers is now creating problems for the civil service. I mean, the number of instruments that are having to be withdrawn, or you've got an error rate, is problematic.
Well, my PhD student, now a lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire, Kate Ollerenshaw, worked out that 1.45% of all statutory instruments were correcting errors in other statutory instruments.
Yeah.
It's not a particularly technically accurate process.
No, it's not very efficient or effective as it stands.
Yeah.
Well, we will be publishing our final proposals from the review shortly, but in the meantime, thank you, David Howarth, for coming on the pod for a really interesting discussion, and your Statute Law Society lecture, we will link to it in the show notes.
Great, thank you very much.
And Ruth, we're back again, and let's talk about a new sight that now lurks within the Commons chamber. If the Speaker in his chair looks towards his left about halfway down the chamber in Minority Party row, there are a couple of imposing new figures there in the shape of, first of all, George Galloway, newly elected as victor of the Rochdale by-election for his Workers' Party, and sat right next to him was Lee Anderson. Not long ago he was Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party. Then he got suspended from the party whip for his remarks about Sadiq Khan. Now he's the sole MP for the Reform Party, the inheritor of the Brexit Party organisation. Nigel Farage is its president, Richard Tice is its leader. They've now got a voice in the Commons chamber. Interesting question is, what's he going to do? Because a single MP on their own can't always make that much impact in Parliament, the loneliness, you might say, of the one-person party.
Yeah, both he and George Galloway will find that it is difficult to make an impact. They can make occasional speeches from the backbenches when they get selected, but you lack the support structures that come with being part of a broader party structure, the sort of the briefings and so on for advice on legislation.
The whips to tell you how to vote.
Whips to tell you how to vote. Interestingly, the backbench groups were quick to kick him out of the Conservative Party WhatsApp groups. So, those kinds of methods.
That's one lifeline, isn't it?
Yeah. He's a bit of a political shapeshifter. This is his third party in 6 years, because, of course, he was also, prior to coming into Parliament, he was a Labour Party member.
He was a Labour Party councillor, indeed. He was working in the office of Gloria De Piero, who was the Labour MP for Ashfield. He switched then, as you said, to the Conservative Party. He was elected under their banner, and now, bada bim, he's Reform's vicar in the House of Commons. So there's quite a 4-minute mile across the political spectrum going on there.
But it's an interesting tell that he recognises that it's going to be a very different role for him as a single MP. He's withdrawn his name from the early day motion criticising the Speaker and expressing no confidence in the Speaker after the Opposition Day debate a few weeks ago that we talked about on a previous episode. So he's recognising that he perhaps needs a slightly different relationship with the Speaker if he's going to get called at all.
I suppose the model, really, for the one-person party is actually Caroline Lucas, who has been fabulously effective as a single MP in the House of Commons and has wielded influence far beyond the strength of her party, which is just her. She's this sort of must-have accessory for cross-party motions. You know, if you want to get a cross-party bandwagon going, get Caroline Lucas and you signed up the Green Party in a single stroke. And she's a very, very effective performer. She's managed to represent her party across a vast spectrum of political issues, and she's been a constant presence in the Commons chamber, and that's the model to aim for. Now, will either George Galloway or Lee Anderson manage anything approaching that performance?
No.
Because it takes both street smarts and incredible levels of energy.
Yeah, no would be my answer. And also Caroline, because of the nature of what she stands for, because of her own personality, she's been able to work together with some of the other smaller parties. So although there aren't any formalised structures for this, they have clubbed together to support each other in terms of producing things like briefings and staffing support and so on, and working together in a cooperative manner on things like amendments. I suspect that kind of group are not going to be open to the Lee Andersons and the George Galloways of this
he's
world.
a much more, well, they're both much more combative figures. And I don't think they'll find it very easy to work with each other either.
No.
I watched the press conference at which Lee Anderson announced he was switching to the Reform Party, and Richard Tice, his party leader, was constantly saying that a major reason for reform to be concerned at the moment was the election of George Galloway. They didn't like the idea that he was now representing a seat in the Commons. So that doesn't exactly suggest that those two are going to be able to work effectively together, even though they were at one point sitting right next to one another in the chamber.
Yeah. The other thing about Lee Anderson's position is he has previously put his name to support a private member's bill brought in by the Conservative MP Anthony Mangnall that would require MPs who change parties mid-Parliament to resign, to step down to fight a by-election. Now, interestingly, Lee Anderson has decided that actually he's not going to do that. Now, he's citing the fact that there's a possibility of a general election in a few weeks, few months, and therefore it would be a waste of time and money for his constituents and for his local council.
Why go through it twice, I suppose?
So that's his argument, which I think probably holds for the next few weeks, because, of course, if we are to have a May election, Parliament has to dissolve on the 26th of this month, so it's less than a fortnight away now. But if that doesn't happen, we haven't got a May election, then there's an argument that perhaps he should follow through on his previously expressed principles.
And of course, there's a particular precedent here in the shape of Douglas Carswell, who switched from the Conservative Party to what was then UKIP back in 2014 and did fight a by-election and made a point of saying that he had to go back to his employers, the voters of his Clacton constituency, to get their endorsement for his shift of party, and that was applauded warmly as a sort of new, more honest, less Westminster form of politics by the then UKIP leadership, brackets Nigel Farage. Doesn't seem to be being applied this time. Now, I suppose you can say fair enough, if there's going to be a general election in a matter of weeks, it's a bit silly to have a by-election, then immediately have another general election. You barely get time to get back into the Commons before you're out again. That argument, as you say, holds for a little while, but if this Parliament's going to roll on for another 6 months, perhaps the voters of his Ashfield constituency ought to be consulted. Now, you mentioned the bill from Anthony Mangnall. Now, he's the MP for Torridge in Devon, where the previous MP was Sarah Williston, elected as a Conservative. She shifted to what started off as Change UK and then went through any number of different incarnations, and she ended up fighting the seat as a Liberal Democrat in 2019 and lost it to Anthony Mangnall. And he came up with a private member's bill aimed at saying precisely that MPs who change their party allegiance should cause a by-election, should see whether their constituents support what they've done. And the interesting thing about this was who opposed it. This was a 10-minute rule bill where you make a 10-minute speech on a motion to bring in a bill on a particular subject, and another person, if they're against it, can make a 10-minute speech against. And the MP who spoke against on this occasion was Steve Baker, also known as Rebel Commander, who had been the unofficial whip of the Brexiteers and had organised the Tory rebels in the build-up to Brexit. And he made an astonishing speech, one of the most brilliant speeches I've heard in the House of Commons, in which he argued that MPs shouldn't be subject to this because they need the ability to defy their own parties. And he said, I reserve the right to burn down my own party if it betrays the principles on which I was elected. Which is a fantastic speech to make. But it underlined the point that subjecting MPs to the idea that if they change their party allegiance, they have to have a by-election, helps tighten the grip of party machines on them. So it was quite an interesting moment. Lee Anderson, I suspect, may have a prospect of holding his Ashfield seat. It's a very funny place with quite particular local politics. There's a large independent group that gets an awful lot of votes there. Now often forgotten that the Liberal Democrats came within a couple of hundred votes of winning that seat in 2010, and the person who was their candidate then is now the leader of that independent group. So there's all sorts of ways in which the votes could divide in Ashfield, and all sorts of results may be possible. Watch that space.
Thanks. Well, Mark, we were going to talk about the fact that next week, if the Prime Minister wanted a general election on the 2nd of May, he'd have to dissolve Parliament on the 26th of March, and therefore next week we'd be looking at the announcement of the general election. But as we're talking, I gather that the Prime Minister's gone on TV in the West Country and confirmed that there will not be a general election on the 2nd of May. So I suppose he could change his mind in the next week or so, but sounds unlikely.
Yeah, well, it never seemed like a particularly probable adventure to embark on, given the state of the polls at the moment. I think the government's very much in Travolta-Micawber mode at the moment, staying alive and waiting for something to turn up. So No great surprise there. We'll get a chance, I'm sure, to talk about the mystic rituals of the parliamentary wash-up where they king through the remaining legislation in short order, but that's for another day.
So it looks like the election ball is just going to keep running through to the summer or the autumn, and we'll have to see what happens.
Be afraid, be very afraid.
Yeah, I think in the circumstances we'll call it a day, Mark, and see you next week, and probably not an election.
See you then.
Well, that's all from us for this week's episode of Parliament Matters. Please hit the follow or subscribe button in your podcast app to get the next episode as soon as it lands.
And help us to make the podcast better by leaving a rating or review on Apple or Spotify and sharing your feedback. Our producer tells us it's important for the algorithm to give the show a boost.
And Mark, tell us more about the algorithm.
Well, what do I know about algorithms? I write my scripts with a quill pen on vellum and then send it in by carrier pigeon.
Well, before we go, a quick reminder also that you can send us your questions on all things Parliament by visiting hansardsociety.org.uk/PMUQ.
We'll be discussing them in future episodes, including our special Urgent Questions editions dedicated to what you want to know about Parliament.
And you can find us across social media at Hansard Society to get more content related to the show and the wider work of the Hansard Society.
Parliament Matters is produced by the Hansard Society and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. For more information, visit hansardsociety.org.uk/PM or find us on social media at Hansard Society.